Hello YouTube, welcome, take a seat, have a cup of tea, and get ready for The Baron. Now, in return to the previous writing advice talks, let's continue along that vein. So, where should we start? Well, in our last talk we discussed the 8 different body types, and I thought it'd be appropriate to go through those in a bit more detail. So, get ready for 8 videos discussing the 8 body types. Now, first and foremost is of course the one we need to talk about primarily, because many people will write their heroes with this body build, many will write their protagonists, their archetypical heroes, villains, that sort of thing. Your very typical body build is of course the average. Now, what do we mean when we say average body build, when we're talking about writing and character creation and other writing art endeavours? You know, the problem there just lies in how many things this can apply to, because we're not just talking about writers, we're not just talking about fiction writers and sci-fi writers, we're not just talking about artists, comic book artists, comic book writers. We are also talking about art in general. We're talking about people out there who want to create original characters, and of course we're talking about role-playing games and other games where you have a character. So, average is such a difficult thing to talk about. The reason being is average is very different across very different fields. So, we need to break it down into what we mean by average. Average literally means average for that person's background, history, culture, race, ethnicity, and gender. Everything. It is what is the average that this person should be. So, let's take a look at me initially. Now, obviously, I'm not average. I'm a very big guy, very big chest, very big arms, and a bit of a belly. Very good. But we're, of course, talking about Caucasian in that sense. Or Middle European would be more accurate. Now, what we mean there in terms of average for a male would be anywhere between 5'8" and 6 foot tall. That seems like a good average. It's a good range. It seems perfectly reasonable to me for someone of average to be in that spectrum. We're also talking about relatively broad shoulders, a broad chest, something of a stomach, maybe some chin hair, because in terms of European, it's very common for people, men especially, to have beards. Some don't, some do. Maybe that's a preference, maybe that's just you can't, or you can. You know who I'm talking about, bub. It still amuses me. No. But then we also have to look at other cultures. For example, Asian, so Japanese, Chinese, Korean, Mongolian. Now, of course, the average height of those countries is a lot smaller. I'm not sure the exact figures, but I believe at last check it was something like 5'6" was the average for a man of those countries. If I'm wrong, please comment below. I'm always happy to be corrected. And there we go. I mean, those are 2 very clear examples where you have men from 2 different countries who are different heights, as well as that, obviously, Asian men have slender shoulders. And that's the important part. You need to relate it to where your character comes from, where your character is descended from, and what their background is. For example, someone who has had a good upbringing, where they've had food readily available, a warm home, a roof over their heads, and e.g. myself, would have a much stockier, much sturdier, much, I don't want to say healthy, because I'm not, I could do losing some weight, so, but there we are, than someone who, say, has come from a not-so-affluent background, where they've not been sure where their next meal is coming from, where they've not been able to have a good roof, a good home, a good house, anything like that. They will not have the same kind of build as someone who has. So you have to relate it to their background as well. And that's why average is such a difficult one to discuss. So, average you need to take at base. You need to take at where did the character come from, who the character is, and what kind of background they have. Are they from a culture where they are more slender in build, in which case that's their average? Are they from a culture where they're more stocky in build? For example, Scandinavian, where obviously much taller, much broader shoulders, much stronger. Obviously, we are. And then we also have to look at time period as well, because if we're talking about Scandinavians nowadays, they are very different to Scandinavians from the 1500s, where we're looking at Vikings, where they were even bigger, even sturdier, because they were raiders, they were warriors. I mean, even the women were warriors, so you have to look at it like that. And again, take gender into specifics. But let's get down to the final part, the main reason for these talks. How would you arm a character of the average build? And again, as I said, that is very difficult to do because of this range. So let's talk about the 3 primary averages for human species, as I would describe it. So we're going to look at Middle European, so broad shoulders, stockier, what we think of as average height, so 5'8" to 6 foot. Then we're going to look at Asian, where we're looking at much shorter, slender builds, narrower shoulders. And then we'll, of course, look at African descent, where we're talking about people who are much taller, much, not as broad of shoulders, but much taller, much... Sorry, I don't really know the right word. It's very difficult, that one. Because it's not slender, but obviously taller, but stronger musculature. So I'd say it's actually a good middle range there. So let's talk about European. So European, the average, let's look at history for God's sake. The average given back then would of course been broadsword and shield. Those were designed for the average. They were designed for people of the Middle European build in the 1500s. And then we come up to modern day and we're looking at assault rifles. We're looking at weapons of medium weight, to take advantage of the broad shoulders and the stronger build, but not so much of the speed that you might necessarily like. They're going to be a bit slower. Then we go over to Asian, where we're looking at Japanese, Chinese, again, Mongolian, Korean. What was the average weapon for people in, say, the same kind of idea, the medieval period and then the modern era? So what would be the average equipment for those builds? And starting off with medieval, 1500, that sort of thing, we're looking more at spears, no shields, because if you look at the history of those cultures, shields weren't common. They were common with Mongolian raiders, but they were not the average. They were the elite. They were a different build entirely. So the average person would have a spear, most likely, and some relatively decent armour to take advantage of that slender build, that slim build. Let's take a look more at African, what we're talking about there. So we're talking about people who are much taller, much similar shoulder width to, say, European, but taller, much more agile, much more lithe. So, what would be the average weapon for them? And I don't really want to say it was spear and shield, because it wouldn't have been. Those were ones that some of the tribes there used, and they were very effective. Looking at the Zulu tribe, and one of my favourite weapons, the Kapinga, which is like a throwing boomerang with blades. Google it, it's awesome. No, the best weapon for the much taller, stronger build, taking advantage of speed, size, and all those factors, you'd be looking more, again, rather than at swords and spears, you'd be looking at axes, taking advantage of that much broader sweep, that much stronger depth. Someone who is taller can get a lot more force out of an axe on a downward swing. So, an average weapon for someone who is taller would be something with a lot more heft and requires a lot more strength, because you can use your gravity to do a lot more damage. So those are our averages. Now, of course, you have to relate that to your fantasy races, your sci-fi races. For example, a dwarf from a fantasy race is not going to use the same weapon as an African man using his height to his advantage. No, you're going to want to use his, shortness to his advantage, because he can get under things. So, we're talking about that when we come up with it. But those are some good averages and some good build ideas. Stay tuned for the next video, where we'll be talking about the elf build, the lithe. Now that should be interesting. Hope you enjoyed the video. Like and subscribe for future videos. Please follow the links below to my Facebook page and my Patreon. And I hope you enjoyed the video. Thank you. Now get out of my house.